Just before we get going, there's a few technical details. You can share any questions in the chat box, and we'll pick those up so that we can ask questions in the final session this morning, which will be just before about 20 to 10. If you want to ask questions in Welsh, we have English-speaking presenters today, so the answers will be in English, but your questions will be translated. And if you want to look at more details about the presenters, you can go to the speaker's biography section on the webpage where you first clicked in. And you can register for the sessions, because that allows us to see your feedback from the sessions, which is really helpful for us in future. And just to let you know that the sessions are being recorded, so you can watch them afterwards as well. Okay, so without further ado, our session this morning involves two colleagues who are colleagues of mine or have been in the past at RSPB, so it's very, very nice for me to be able to introduce them to you. First up, we have Brendan Costelloe, who is currently the policy manager at the British Ecological Society, but this is actually his last day before going on to an important job in DEFRA. And then after Brendan, we'll be speaking to John Cryer for the policy officer at RSPB Cymru. Okay, over to Brendan.
Thank you very much, Katie Jo. Good morning, everybody. So, yes, this is basically a presentation of the Nature-Based Solutions report that the British Ecological Society carried out. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the British Ecological Society, we are a learned society of ecologists. We have around 6,000 members from across the UK and around the world, 7 really high quality journals, and the policy work that we do seeks to further ecology by providing policymakers with the best ecological evidence to inform their decisions. We do this across the UK, and we have a Welsh policy group. So moving on to the report, obviously nature-based solutions are potentially, they can potentially cover a huge amount of things, but what we tried to focus on were nature-based solutions that work with and enhance nature in order to mitigate or adapt to climate change while simultaneously providing benefits to biodiversity and people. The report is really focused on the UK, but we drew on evidence from around the world where it was applicable to the UK. It was an assessment of evidence for every UK habitat type, every major habitat type and landscape. Further to that, we did an analysis of the policy framework that we would need to actually deliver MBS at the scale at which we need to deliver MBS. Over 100 people contributed to the report from across the UK, mainly people working in academia, but also a lot of expertise from the statutory agencies. This was a blessing, but also something of a curse, as you can imagine, during a global pandemic. I should also say, as Katie Jo pointed out, I am the policy manager of the MBS. So we had people with really incredible expertise for all of these habitats working on the report. I am not an expert in any of these habitats like these people are, let alone all of them. There's one thing you quickly learn at the BES, and that's how much you're not an expert in. The target audience for the report are policymakers and regulators across the UK, landowners interested in MBS, and potential investors. And I should also say that we haven't quite finished the report. We are almost there. So please take this as my reflections on an almost finished report rather than necessarily the final BES position. So what did we find? First thing I think to point out is that MBS is not a panacea to our problems. It can make a significant contribution, but the most significant contribution to tackling climate change is reducing emissions. And as a paper from folk up at James Hutton quite neatly said, you can perhaps think about MBS as being the final 10% reduction of the 80% overall reductions we need to make between now and 2050. Really crucial to this is making sure that actually in our nationally determined contributions, it very explicitly sets out what we hope to get from nature-based solutions, and importantly also within that context makes it clear that those nature-based solutions need to deliver for biodiversity, lest we end up with a whole load of conifer plantations that might be good for climate mitigation but less so for biodiversity. It's also really important to have separate targets for negative emissions. By that, I mean basically taking carbon out of the air, and also for emissions reductions. And that allows us to understand whether our MBS are working, and also whether our policies for emissions reductions from industry are working. And this is really important. I know the next presentation is going to kind of go into this in more detail, but again, just to emphasize that this is a real window of opportunity here. We know that nature-based solutions can make a significant contribution to green recovery and people's well-being. There is a lot of emerging evidence showing that people have been getting outside more during the pandemic. They've been getting more from nature during the pandemic. Around the green recovery stuff, huge amounts of really impressive literature about the returns on investment you can get. For instance, in the States, showing that you create more jobs from coastal habitat restoration than you do from traditional polluting industries such as coal, gas, etc. But the window of opportunity is also around the policies that we're developing. So obviously, as we leave the European Union, there's a lot of policy flux. We're developing really kind of cornerstone conservation policies at the moment, and they absolutely have to be designed in a way that can deliver nature-based solutions, or it's a real wasted opportunity. Front of this is the future kind of environmental stewardship schemes that replace CAP. To make nature-based solutions work at scale, you're going to need huge take-up across large areas and a huge concentration of take-up across large areas. So really important in the design of these future schemes is enabling that widespread take-up across appropriate areas. A lot of evidence showing that partnership working is really important in this regard, and the right kind of advice. Whereas written advice doesn't seem to have the same effect, and I think that comes across quite clearly in the research, so that's something to think about. Durability is really important, especially when we're talking about climate mitigation. We need to have enforceable conservation covenants to make this work, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned from Scotland in this regard. We need a robust regulatory baseline, so we don't just need to be paying for the big flagship nature-based solutions. We need to be ensuring that agricultural practices are not eroding the natural capital upon which our nature-based solutions depend. So you've got to get that regulatory baseline right. And another crucial point that I missed off this slide is we must have an environmental assessment framework that is fit for purpose and can ensure that we don't get perverse outcomes from nature-based solutions. So the obvious example being the wrong trees in the wrong place. Is our environmental framework, assessment framework, set up to do that? I'm not sure it is, and that's going to need a lot of thought. So what did we find in terms of habitats? Coastal and marine was really interesting. It's obviously a huge area, but contrary to some of the kind of hype around blue carbon, we didn't actually find that it was as impressive as some of the more impressive terrestrial habitats. Tends to be kind of lower and slower sequestration rates per hectare than the more impressive terrestrial habitats. That said, salt marsh does come across very strongly. It obviously has high biodiversity values, sequesters more carbon than other marine or coastal habitats, and it does it really quickly. And this is really important when we're thinking about achieving or hitting our targets for 2050. And huge adaptation potential in terms of dissipating wave energy and reducing wave attenuation. So you get really good return on your investment for salt marsh restoration. So that should definitely be a priority. Built environment was really interesting. Not going to be news to any of you guys, but high levels of biodiversity, particularly among pollinators and brownfield sites. Street trees came across as a really good intervention and really powerful intervention. Really impressive figures here we came across that showed 0.2% of Britain's overground carbon is in Leicester's street trees, despite Leicester only being 0.03% of Britain's land area, which is incredible. And the thing to remember with the built environment is a lot of it is public realm. So in theory, it should be easier to develop because lots of the land is owned by public bodies. However, historically, most of the money that has been available for what kind of weren't called nature-based solutions at the time, but we're now kind of describing as nature-based solutions, came from European regional development funding, particularly actually in Wales and Scotland. And as we move forward, the Shared Prosperity Fund, which the government have said is going to replace it, has to have environmental streams that replicate it, or there's going to be a huge funding gap in terms of delivering environmental improvements in urban areas. Other key thing to think about within urban areas is obviously there's a huge amount of competing interests in urban spaces, lots of different problems you're having to deal with in terms of socioeconomic disparities, etc. So particularly important to think about delivering MBS that have a range of co-benefits. Grasslands, very interesting. The soil underneath grasslands contains the highest amount of carbon. Obviously huge land area across the UK, but very variable. Really important to protect the high biodiversity areas, especially the semi-natural grassland that we've still got left. From a climate mitigation perspective, some of the interesting findings around grazing were that basically all kinds of grazing reduce the extent to which grassland sequesters carbon and stores carbon. It doesn't stop them doing it, but it reduces the degree to which they can. Moderate, and I can't necessarily explain moderate right now, but essentially intermediate levels of grazing were seen to be the best or the least bad option in this case. Another interesting point, and perhaps this comes back to the environmental assessments, is that a lot of kind of degraded grasslands that people might think is suitable, for instance, for tree planting, is actually degraded peat or heathland, and if it is, it should be restored to those habitats, and especially with restoration to heathland, which can create a lot of biodiversity benefits as well as carbon benefits. And heathlands were also shown to be very impressive in terms of their carbon sequestration and storage, especially storage. Peatlands, we're on to the kind of big hitters now. Peatlands, most carbon dense ecosystem on Earth, make up around 10% of the UK land area. So in theory, they're one of our biggest climate assets, but because of the way they're being managed, are essentially our biggest climate liability at the moment. Only about 20% of the UK's peatlands are in good condition, and that means they're emitting more than 3 times the emissions of the whole agriculture sector, which is just astonishing. Restoration of peatlands has to be a priority. It's a kind of no-brainer, no regrets situation. Things for doing this is banning burning. A lot of the people who worked on the report looked at all the evidence. It isn't unequivocal, but on balance, it's pretty clear that that would be the right option, especially when you're taking into account the precautionary principle, which of course you should when it comes to climate change. Woodlands, now this is the most difficult of all of the chapters, and it's one in which we're still having a lot of debate among the authors. So one thing that is very clear, afforestation on organic soils will not deliver climate benefits, certainly not within the 2050 timeframe, and it may never do that if you're planting. So that absolutely has to be avoided. The whole like broadleaf species versus kind of exotic commercial species which sequesters carbon more quickly, again, is quite unclear. I mean, they're ballpark pretty similar, is what seems to be coming across actually. But obviously broadleaf woodland is far better for biodiversity, although in some cases kind of well-managed conifer plantations can have benefits for biodiversity if they're planted on very degraded agricultural land, for instance. In terms of whether you should plant or allow natural regeneration, planting will deliver better climate results because the trees just grow more quickly, less competition, those horrible plastic things create a favourable microclimate. But natural regeneration is preferable from a genetic diversity perspective, which is helpful in terms of reducing risks from pathogens, pests and invasives, and probably preferable from a biodiversity perspective because you get improved structural diversity. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. So if you can't be planting on organic soils, you should be planting on mineral soils. However, you obviously need to avoid the high biodiversity, mineral soils and grasslands. That doesn't leave you with necessarily that much to play with, and the area of land that you do have to play with tends to be very productive, and it's very expensive to incentivize tree planting in those areas. So that's a massive policy challenge for policymakers going forward. And another key point that came through is that we need to reduce our reliance on imported timber. We're the second biggest importer of timber in the whole world, behind China, and that's a big part of our overseas environmental footprint. Concrete, 8% of global emissions. We need to do something about that. So what role commercial forestry? Really kind of controversial subject. Whether or not it could ever be considered an MBS. Is it a nature-based solution to concrete? Discuss. Very controversial, and I will in fact move on quickly. So if it's going to be really hard to plant in or on organic soils just because of the economics of it, sorry, not to plant altogether, but for widespread afforestation in the soil, where you want to do it from a climate perspective because you won't get the climate benefits. What can we do hereafter? Interestingly, lots of the research that came through around agroforestry, silvopasture, and good old-fashioned hedgerows was really positive, actually, and might be certainly a big part of the puzzle here. Hedgerows store a huge amount of carbon, up to 100 tons per hectare, which is really impressive. Hugely valuable from a biodiversity perspective. Primary habitat for around 30% of our Section 41 bird species. They also improve soil resilience, which enables the kind of agricultural landscape to adapt to climate change, and they can provide shelter for livestock. Agroforestry systems, again, reasonably impressive carbon figures, again help with climate adaptation, and they also bring additional kind of nature-based solutions to pest management through providing suitable habitat for pest predators, and the evidence around the impact it has on productivity is mixed, but I think on balance it doesn't tend to indicate that certainly at kind of moderate densities it has a negative impact on productivity, although a lot more research is needed in this area. Some cases it's been shown to improve productivity in quite a few studies actually. Silvopasture, again, very impressive. It's been shown to store more carbon than woodland or pasture in some studies. Again, it's helpful for livestock productivity through providing shelter. But, as I said, I think the really important thing to understand here is at what thresholds you begin to have an impact on productivity. The environmental benefits, I think, are very clear. And what we can see so far, it shouldn't have too much of a negative impact on productivity, but what are your thresholds? All of these interventions obviously help to make what has historically been a bit of a hostile kind of agricultural landscape for all the wildlife a lot more sympathetic, especially outside of our protected areas. And so that's a big tick in the box for those systems. So I think I'm pretty much out of time, and I will leave it there. But that was a kind of brief, very quick run through of what is a huge report that will hopefully be ready early in the new year.
Thank you so much, Brendan. It's clearly going to be a huge resource for us, I think, this report. Do you know when it's coming out? You said in the new year.
Hopefully end of January, early February. But because we've got so many people working on it, that the whole pandemic has been quite a problem, as you can imagine.
Yeah, sure. Well, that feels very soon. It looks like a must read for many of us on this call, I think. Thank you so much. That's really interesting.